They killed her because she knew too much. And for 12 centuries after her death, the world was made to forget that she ever existed. But here is what they could not erase: the mathematics she taught, the astronomy she advanced, and the philosophical tradition she carried in her hands like a torch. That knowledge survived. It traveled. It transformed civilizations. And it did so while her name was buried under centuries of deliberate silence. For the African diaspora today, Hypatia of Alexandria is not simply a tragic figure from ancient history. She is a mirror. She is proof that the pattern of stealing genius while destroying the genius who created it did not begin in 1619 on the shores of Virginia. It began much earlier, in the city her family helped make the intellectual capital of the world. Understanding what happened to Hypatia means understanding something essential about how power works, how it takes what it needs, discards what it fears, and then rewrites the story to make the theft look like a gift. The African diaspora has lived this story in its bones for generations. And that is exactly why her story belongs to us, why reclaiming it is not academic exercise but an act of profound resistance and ancestral pride. Alexandria, Egypt. The year is roughly 360 AD, and into this city, already ancient, already legendary, a girl is born who will become the most educated human being in the known world. Her name is Hypatia, and her father is Theon of Alexandria, one of the most distinguished mathematicians and astronomers of his era. Theon held a position at the Great Museion, the research institution connected to the legendary Library of Alexandria, a place that represented the accumulated knowledge of African, Egyptian, Greek, Babylonian, and Persian intellectual traditions gathered in one location on the African continent. Theon was not simply a teacher. He was a scholar who produced definitive editions of Euclid's Elements and Ptolemy's Almagest, the foundational text of geometry and astronomy in the ancient world. And he raised his daughter to surpass him. Hypatia did exactly that. By the time she reached adulthood, she had become head of the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria, a position of extraordinary intellectual authority. Students traveled from across the Mediterranean world, from Rome, from Constantinople, from Syria, to sit at her feet. She lectured publicly. She rode through the streets of Alexandria in her academic robes, speaking to crowds about astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. She corresponded with the most powerful political figures of her age, including Orestes, the Roman prefect of Alexandria, who counted her among his most trusted advisors. She wrote commentaries on the works of Diophantus, the mathematician whose algebraic methods would later be called revolutionary when Europeans rediscovered them centuries later. She co-wrote with her father the definitive commentary on Ptolemy's astronomical tables. She developed instruments for scientific observation, including the astrolabe and the hydrometer. She was not operating on the margins of intellectual life. She was its center. And she was doing all of this as a woman. In Alexandria. In Africa. In the 4th century AD. Her murder in March of 415 AD was not an accident of religious hysteria, though that is how it has most often been told. It was a political assassination dressed in theological clothing. The city of Alexandria was caught in a power struggle between Cyril, the newly installed bishop of Alexandria who was aggressively consolidating Christian institutional authority, and Orestes, the Roman prefect who represented secular imperial power and who openly valued Hypatia's counsel. Cyril's allies spread rumors that Hypatia was a witch, that she practiced dark arts, that her influence over Orestes was demonic. A mob of Parabolani, a group of Christian zealots who functioned essentially as Cyril's enforcers, intercepted her carriage in the street. They dragged her into a church called Caesareum. They stripped her naked, killed her with sharpened ceramic tiles or oyster shells depending on the historical account, dismembered her body, and burned her remains. She was somewhere between 50 and 60 years old. The Roman historian Socrates Scholasticus, writing within decades of her death, described the event with horror and placed blame squarely on Cyril's faction. But what happened next was the deeper crime. What happened next was the systematic erasure of what she represented and what she knew. The knowledge Hypatia carried was not Greek knowledge in the sense that European historians later claimed. It was African knowledge, synthesized African knowledge, Egyptian mathematical and astronomical traditions that predated the Greek world by thousands of years, combined with Babylonian astronomical records, combined with the innovative work being done in Alexandria itself, which sat on African soil and drew on African intellectual labor for its entire existence. The Library of Alexandria, which had been partially damaged and reduced over decades before Hypatia's time, represented this synthesis. And when Hypatia was killed, when Cyril's faction celebrated rather than mourned, what followed was an accelerating flight of scholars from Alexandria. The intellectual community dispersed. Some went to Athens. Some went eastward, to Persia, to the centers of Islamic scholarship that would eventually preserve and build upon exactly the mathematical and astronomical traditions that Hypatia had taught. Here is what was deliberately suppressed in the European historical record, the direct line between Hypatia's mathematical work and the algebra that Europe would not encounter again until the 12th and 13th centuries, when Latin scholars began translating Arabic texts. Diophantus, whose Arithmetica Hypatia had commented upon and transmitted, contained the seeds of algebraic thinking that would eventually flower in the work of Al-Khwarizmi, the 9th century Persian mathematician who gave the word algebra from the Arabic al-jabr and whose name gave us the word algorithm. That transmission chain runs directly through Alexandria, through the scholars who fled Alexandria's intellectual collapse, through the Persian academies that received them,